A single slip of the tongue in a mansion built on blood and silence changed everything. He was the ruthless king of the underworld, a man whose gaze promised death. She was just a desperate maid trying to survive. But when she accidentally called him my husband, the ice finally cracked. The Romano estate sat on a secluded cliffside overlooking the churning waters of the Atlantic, a sprawling fortress of grey stone and bulletproof glass. To the outside world, it was the architectural triumph of Lorenzo Romano, a notoriously reclusive billionaire. To those who knew the truth, it was the nerve center of the East Coast's most lethal Mafia syndicate. Inside its walls, the temperature always seemed to drop. The house was governed by a suffocating silence, dictated by the temperament of its master. Lorenzo had not smiled in 5 years, not since the night a rival family ambushed his father's motorcade, leaving Lorenzo with the heavy crown of the syndicate and a heart that had turned to absolute frost. He was a man of sharp angles, tailored Italian suits, and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Men twice his age trembled when he entered a room. He did not yell. He simply looked at you, and you knew your life was entirely in his hands. Harper Hayes knew none of this when she took the job. At 22, Harper was running on fumes and absolute desperation. Her older brother, Liam, had racked up a crippling debt with underground loan sharks in Boston, forcing Harper to flee into the shadows. She had changed her last name, scrubbed her digital footprint, and begged for a live-in housekeeping position through an old agency connection. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman with iron grey hair, had hired Harper out of pity, handing her a stiff black-and-white uniform and a list of rules that read like a survival manual. Rule number 1, never make eye contact with Mr. Romano. Rule number 2, if you are in a room when he enters, make yourself invisible or leave immediately. Rule number 3, never, under any circumstances, speak to him unless a direct question is asked. For 3 weeks, Harper navigated the massive estate like a ghost. She polished the imported mahogany, scrubbed the Carrara marble floors, and avoided the West Wing entirely. But exhaustion makes fools of the cautious. It was a Tuesday evening, long past midnight. Harper was running on 2 hours of sleep, her mind completely scrambled by a terrifying phone call she had received earlier that afternoon. A debt collector had somehow tracked down her burner phone. In a sheer panic, Harper had lied, shouting into the receiver, "You have the wrong person. I'm a married woman. My husband is a police officer. Leave us alone." She had spent the rest of the day chanting the lie in her head, trying to convince herself she was safe, trying to manifest a protector that didn't exist. Mrs. Gable had caught a terrible flu, leaving the skeleton night crew dangerously understaffed. When the buzzer from Lorenzo's private study rang, demanding fresh bourbon and ice, Harper was the only one available. Her hands shook as she arranged the crystal decanter and heavy tumblers on a silver tray. As she approached the heavy oak doors of the study, she could hear the low, menacing hum of voices. She knocked once, lightly, and pushed the door open. The study was dim, smelling of expensive tobacco and aged leather. Lorenzo sat behind his massive desk, his dark eyes fixed on a bleeding, bruised man kneeling on the Persian rug. Standing beside Lorenzo was his lethal underboss, Felix, casually adjusting his cuffs. Harper froze, all the blood draining from her face. She had walked into an interrogation. "Put it on the table," Lorenzo commanded. His voice was like a silencer, quiet, deadly, and void of any humanity. He didn't even look at her. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, terrified that if she saw too much, she would be buried in the gardens before morning. She moved toward the side table, her hands trembling so violently that the ice clinked loudly against the crystal decanter. I said, "Who gave you the shipment routes, Leo?" Lorenzo asked the bleeding man, his tone devoid of inflection. "I swear to God, boss, I don't know," the man sobbed. Lorenzo sighed, a sound of profound boredom. He pulled a heavy silver-plated firearm from his desk drawer and set it gently on the wood. The loud thud of the metal echoing in the quiet room was the breaking point for Harper's exhausted, terrified nervous system. She flinched violently. The silver tray tipped. The crystal decanter slid, crashing onto the marble edge of the side table. It shattered with a deafening crack, splashing 50-year-old bourbon across the floor and onto the hem of Lorenzo's custom slacks. Silence descended on the room. It was thick, heavy, and absolute. Felix's hand went to his holster. The bleeding man on the floor stopped sobbing. Lorenzo slowly turned his head, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto Harper. For the first time, she looked directly into the face of the devil. His jaw was clenched, his expression an unreadable mask of impending violence. "What," Lorenzo whispered, "did you just do?" Panic completely overrode Harper's brain. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords seized. She dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather the shards of glass with her bare hands, cutting her index finger in the process. Blood bloomed across the pale skin. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her mind short-circuiting. Between the sheer terror of the gun, the exhaustion, and the residual panic from her phone call earlier, her brain scrambled for the lie she had been rehearsing all day to protect herself. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, looking up at the most dangerous man in the city with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I didn't mean to, my husband." The words hung in the air. "My husband." Felix froze, his mouth slightly open in utter disbelief. The bruised man on the floor blinked, momentarily forgetting his own impending doom. Lorenzo Romano stared at the small, trembling maid bleeding onto his floor. His dark eyes widened, just a fraction of a millimeter. The sheer absurdity of the statement, the innocent, terrified way it had fallen from her lips, clashed so violently with the blood-soaked reality of his life that something shifted deep within him. He looked at her doe-like eyes, the stray strand of brown hair falling across her pale forehead, the blood on her fingers. And then, the impossible happened. The corner of Lorenzo Romano's mouth twitched. A low, dark sound escaped his throat. It took Felix a full 5 seconds to realize what he was hearing. The boss was chuckling. Lorenzo leaned back in his leather chair, a genuine, albeit terrifying, smirk playing on his lips. "Your husband?" he repeated, his voice dropping an octave, practically purring with dark amusement. Harper realized what she had said. The color violently rushed back to her face, turning her cheeks scarlet. I mean, sir, Mr. Romano, I misspoke. I was—" "Leave the glass," Lorenzo interrupted, his tone suddenly shifting back to authority, though the icy edge was notably absent. He looked at Felix. "Get Leo out of here. He's ruining the carpet. And tell Mrs. Gable to send someone else to clean this up." He looked back down at Harper, his gaze intense, stripping away every secret she thought she was hiding. "Go bandage your hand, wife." Harper scrambled to her feet and fled to the room, her heart threatening to beat straight out of her chest. She had just signed her own death warrant. Harper did not sleep a single wink that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, her bags packed, waiting for a knock on the door and a bullet to the head. You did not speak to a Mafia don that way. You certainly did not claim him in front of his men. But the morning sun rose, and no assassins came. Instead, at 6 a.m., a sharp rap on the door startled her. It was Mrs. Gable, looking paler than usual despite her flu. "Mr. Romano wants you in the main dining room," she coughed, her eyes darting over Harper's packed duffel bag. "I suggest you unpack that. If he wanted you gone, you wouldn't be breathing." Harper felt a cold sweat break out over her neck. She smoothed down her apron and walked the long, echoing corridors to the east wing. Lorenzo was seated at the head of a massive mahogany dining table, casually sipping an espresso while reading a financial newspaper. He wore a crisp black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a network of intricate dark tattoos climbing his forearms. He didn't look up when she entered. "Pour the coffee," he commanded quietly. Harper approached, her bandaged hand trembling as she picked up the silver carafe. She poured the dark liquid, praying she wouldn't spill it again. "So," Lorenzo said, finally lowering the paper. His dark eyes locked onto hers, pinning her in place. "Harper Hayes, according to my background check, you don't have a husband. In fact, you don't have much of a history at all prior to 2 years ago. It's almost as if you're hiding." Harper stopped pouring. Her breath caught in her throat. He had looked into her. I'm just a maid, sir," she whispered. "You're a liability who walked into my private study during a delicate conversation," Lorenzo corrected smoothly. "My underboss believes I should have you disposed of. He thinks your little slip of the tongue was a calculated move to distract me. Was it, Harper?" "No," she blurted out, fear overriding her manners. "I swear, I was terrified. I was just on the phone earlier. A debt collector called. I panicked and lied to him, told him my husband was a cop so he would leave me alone. The words were just stuck in my head. I swear on my life." Lorenzo studied her face. He was an expert at reading liars. His life depended on it. He saw the raw, unfiltered terror in her eyes, the genuine shame of the mistake. She wasn't an assassin. She was just a frightened girl. "A debt collector," Lorenzo mused, leaning back. "You owe money?" "My brother does," she whispered, looking at her shoes. Lorenzo was silent for a long moment. He should fire her. He should throw her out onto the street and let the debt collectors have her. It was the logical, ruthless thing to do. But he found himself oddly intrigued by the girl who had managed to crack his iron composure. The house had been a tomb for 5 years. She was a sudden, chaotic spark of life. "You will no longer report to Mrs. Gable," Lorenzo announced, picking up his espresso cup. "You are now my personal attendant. You will serve my meals, manage my private quarters, and be available whenever I require. You will not leave this estate without my permission. Do you understand?" Harper blinked, completely derailed. "Your personal attendant?" "Consider it payment for the antique decanter you shattered," Lorenzo said dryly. "And Harper, call me husband again, and I'll make sure you actually have to marry me. I can assure you you won't survive the honeymoon." It was a threat, laced with a strange, dark humor that made Harper's stomach flutter nervously. She nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Romano." For the next 2 weeks, Harper's life transformed into a bizarre, high-stakes dance. She shadowed Lorenzo, adapting to his rigorous, violent lifestyle. She learned that he drank his coffee black, that he suffered from brutal insomnia, and that he spent hours staring at a painting of his late mother in the West Corridor. She also learned that despite his ruthless reputation, he was fiercely protective of the people loyal to him. The tension between them was a living, breathing thing. Lorenzo watched her constantly. He tested her boundaries, assigning her to organize his desk where classified syndicate ledgers lay open, just to see if she would snoop. She never did. One evening, Lorenzo returned from a meeting in the city with blood soaking through the shoulder of his white shirt. He bypassed the medical staff and summoned Harper to his private bathroom. "Clean it," he ordered, sitting on the edge of the marble bathtub, his jaw tight with pain. It was a grazing bullet wound, not deep, but bleeding heavily. Harper's hands shook as she grabbed the first aid kit. As she unbuttoned his ruined shirt, her knuckles brushed against the hard, warm muscles of his chest. Lorenzo inhaled sharply. Harper's eyes flicked up to his face. They were inches apart. The cold Mafia boss wasn't looking at her like a servant anymore. His dark eyes were hooded, burning with a dangerous intensity that made Harper's breath hitch. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet bathroom. "I've never patched a bullet wound before," she whispered back, applying antiseptic to the cotton pad. "You're doing fine," he said softly, his uninjured hand suddenly coming up to grip her waist, steadying her. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. For a second, the Mafia boss and the maid faded away, leaving only a man and a woman in the heavy, humid air. But the fragile moment was shattered the next morning. Harper was pouring coffee in the study when Felix walked in, looking grim. Behind him, two massive enforcers dragged a bruised, terrified man into the room and threw him onto the rug. "Caught this rat scoping out the perimeter near the east gates," Felix reported to Lorenzo. "Says he's looking for someone who owes his boss money. Name is Donovan." Harper dropped the silver carafe. It hit the floor with a loud clang, hot coffee splashing everywhere. Lorenzo's head snapped toward her. He saw the color drain completely from her face as she stared at the man on the floor. Donovan, the loan shark from Boston, looked up at the noise. He squinted at Harper, a bloody, cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," Donovan coughed. "Found you, you little bitch. Your brother's time is up." The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Lorenzo Romano slowly stood up from his desk, his eyes locked onto Donovan with a terrifying, murderous rage. The collision of Harper's desperate past and Lorenzo's violent present had finally happened, and there would be hell to pay. Donovan's cruel, gravelly laughter echoed through the cavernous study, grating violently against the opulent mahogany walls and the heavy silence of the estate. Lorenzo Romano did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped around his massive desk with the fluid, silent grace of a seasoned predator. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the air growing suffocatingly dense with impending violence. "You brought a weapon onto my estate," Lorenzo stated. It wasn't a question. It was a definitive, absolute death sentence. "Hey man, this is strictly business," Donovan stammered, his bravado faltering as the terrifying realization of whose floor he was bleeding on finally pierced his arrogant skull. "The O'Sullivan crew out of South Boston sent me. Her brother, Liam, owes us 200 grand, plus interest." Harper backed against the wall, her hands pressed desperately over her mouth. $200,000. She felt the grand room tilt dangerously on its axis. Liam had lied to her. He had sworn it was just a few thousand, a minor gambling debt he could easily manage. This was a death warrant. "This woman," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper as he stopped mere inches from Donovan's bruised face, "is my personal staff. She is under my direct protection. You do not hunt on my property. You do not speak to her." "She's collateral," Donovan spat back. panic making him foolishly brave. "Liam stole a shipment from our boss, Mickey Sullivan. You know how the underworld works, Romano. Blood pays for blood." Lorenzo's hand moved faster than Harper's exhausted eyes could track. He drew the heavy, silver-plated firearm from his tailored waistband and pressed it directly against Donovan's left kneecap. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed, acoustic perfection of the study. Donovan screamed, a raw, agonizing sound of pure torture that tore through the quiet elegance of the mansion. Harper clamped her trembling hands tightly over her ears, shutting her eyes to block out the horrific spray of crimson on the antique Persian rug. "Felix," Lorenzo ordered, his voice remaining perfectly, chillingly calm as the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filled the sophisticated room. "Take this piece of Boston trash to the Seaport District docks. Dump him directly on Mickey Sullivan's territory with a clear message. The girl's debt is paid in full. If any of Sullivan's men step foot in New York territory again, I will personally burn South Boston to the ground." Felix hesitated, a dangerous, barely concealed flicker of disapproval crossing his hardened, scarred features. "Boss, respectfully, starting an all-out war with the Irish mob over a domestic servant. It's incredibly bad business. The 5 families won't stand for it. It disrupts the supply lines." Lorenzo slowly turned his dark, lethal gaze toward his second-in-command. "Did I ask for a syndicate financial consultation, Felix? Or did I give you a direct order?" Felix swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking before he nodded sharply. "Yes, boss." He unceremoniously dragged the sobbing, bleeding Donovan out of the room, leaving a horrific, smeared trail of red across the priceless rug. The heavy oak doors clicked securely shut. Lorenzo stood alone in the center of the room, slowly lowering the smoking weapon. He turned to look at Harper. She was trembling violently, her knees finally giving out as she slid down the intricately paneled wall to sit on the cold marble border, weeping silently into her hands. Lorenzo approached her, his polished Italian leather shoes stopping inches from her stiff black-and-white uniform. He crouched down, his large, heavily tattooed hand reaching out to gently, almost hesitantly, tilt her chin up. His calloused thumb brushed away a falling tear. The stark contrast between the ruthless Mafia Don, who had just shattered a man's kneecap without blinking, and the gentleman touching her face with infinite care, was utterly dizzying. "He will never hurt you," Lorenzo murmured, his dark, unfathomable eyes searching her terrified ones. "No one in this city is going to hurt you, Harper. You just started a gang war," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Because of me. Why would you do that?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a complex storm of emotions warring behind his stoic mask. "Because you belong to me now, and I protect what is mine." Over the next month, the rigid, terrifying dynamics within the Romano fortress shifted dramatically. Harper was no longer relegated to the shadows as a simple maid. She had inadvertently become Lorenzo's constant shadow, his trusted confidant, and the only person capable of softening his lethally sharp edges. They spent long, quiet, late nights in the study. Lorenzo would drink aged Macallan scotch, while Harper read aloud from old leather-bound historical biographies to ease his chronic, agonizing insomnia. The silent, terrifying king of the underworld slowly began to show genuine cracks of humanity. He actually smiled, a small, secret, breathtaking smile, when she bravely teased him about his obsessive neatness regarding his desk. He personally ordered the estate kitchen to endlessly stock her favorite brand of chamomile tea. But the criminal underworld is a beast that never sleeps, and it certainly does not forgive weakness. Felix, watching Lorenzo's legendary ironclad focus waver, decided that Harper was a fatal, poisonous distraction. The international syndicate required a ruthless, unfeeling king, not a soft man playing house with a terrified, penniless girl from Boston. Felix quietly began to feed highly classified security schedules to the Sullivan crew, orchestrating a massive betrayal that would eliminate the problem without getting his own hands visibly dirty. The deadly trap was meticulously set on a torrential Tuesday evening. Lorenzo had an urgent, unavoidable meeting at an abandoned, sprawling warehouse near the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was supposedly neutral ground to negotiate a lucrative truce with the warring Italian factions. Citing the terrible weather and security risks, he insisted Harper stay behind, safely surrounded by his best perimeter guards. The vow. Harper paced the length of her opulent bedroom. Dread settled heavily in the pit of her stomach. Something was horribly wrong. That very afternoon, she had noticed Felix nervously slipping an untraceable burner phone into his inner jacket pocket, a direct violation of internal communication protocols. Acting on pure instinct, she snooped through the encrypted security logs on the desk tablet of Lorenzo, while pretending to dust. The perimeter guards stationed at the Navy Yard had been secretly swapped out. Felix had systematically replaced the most loyal men with his own hand-picked, very greedy mercenaries. It was a setup, a total coup. Panic flooded her veins. Harper knew she did not have time to call for outside backup because Felix completely controlled the internal house security servers. She threw on a dark wool coat and grabbed spare electronic keys to a black sedan downstairs immediately. She slipped out undetected through the underground service exit of the kitchen. The frantic drive to Brooklyn was a terrifying blur of wet highways, blaring horns, and pure terror. She arrived at the desolate Navy Yard just as the worst of the brutal storm broke overhead with violent lightning flashes. She parked a block away, creeping quietly through the torrential downpour and deep shadows toward the designated warehouse. Inside, the unfolding scene was an absolute nightmare. Lorenzo and his two remaining loyal bodyguards were heavily pinned down behind massive steel shipping crates, while heavily armed men were advancing very slowly. A dozen mercenaries with tactical assault rifles methodically closed the net. Felix stood safely near the rear exit, watching the bloody ambush unfold with cold detachment. He shouted that it was over, and that the syndicate needed a real leader who does not risk their empire for a servant girl. Lorenzo fired back. His striking face was a terrifying mask of absolute concentration. His men were badly wounded. His ammunition was running critically low. He realized with a sinking heart that he was likely going to die in this rusted tomb, betrayed by his oldest friend in the entire world. His only comforting thought was that Harper was safe at the estate. Suddenly, the screech of burning tires echoed through the massive warehouse. Harper drove the heavy black sedan straight through the corrugated metal loading doors, shattering them into 1,000 jagged pieces of flying shrapnel across the concrete floor. The vehicle careened wildly into the warehouse. The blinding headlights swept across the room and stunned the advancing gunman. She slammed her foot on the brakes. The heavy car skidded uncontrollably before crashing violently into a towering stack of empty industrial oil drums, sending them tumbling like massive bowling pins. Total chaos erupted immediately. The mercenaries scrambled, completely disoriented and terrified by the sudden automotive intrusion. The dark eyes of Lorenzo widened in unparalleled disbelief as he saw Harper behind the deployed airbag. Her pale face was fiercely determined. The massive distraction was exactly the opening he desperately needed then. Moving with lethal precision, Lorenzo and his guards broke cover. They systematically eliminated the remaining bewildered threats in a highly efficient crossfire. Felix realized his grand coup had failed. He turned to sprint toward the docks, but Lorenzo was significantly faster and tackled his treacherous underboss to the hard floor. His heavy fist connected solidly with bone. The warehouse finally fell eerily silent, save for the rhythmic rain pounding on the metal roof and the groans of the wounded. Lorenzo hauled Felix up by his blood-stained collar. His eyes burned with a bottomless, murderous rage that promised absolute destruction. He snarled that Felix had betrayed the family. Felix spat defensively that the girl made him incredibly weak. Lorenzo corrected him softly, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. He said she made him human, and now he was going to enthusiastically show Felix how ruthless a human can be. He sharply signaled to his guards, who dragged the screaming Felix away into the darkest shadows of the yard. Lorenzo turned immediately. His broad chest heaved as he sprinted frantically toward the smoking sedan. Harper was violently struggling to push the deflating airbag away from her face in the car. Lorenzo ripped the damaged door open with sheer force. His large hands frantically checked every inch of her for injuries. He roared to ask if she was insane. His deep voice cracked with an intense emotion he had not felt in 5 cold years, which was pure and paralyzing fear. He told her she could have been slaughtered. She gasped that she could not just sit there and let them hunt him. She said he was betrayed, and she had to do something. Hot tears mixed freely with the cold rain on her pale face as she looked at him. Lorenzo aggressively pulled her out of the wrecked vehicle, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and burying his face deep into her wet hair. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe. His racing heart hammered furiously against her chest in that rusted, tragic, and completely bloody warehouse. The untouchable king of the underworld fully realized his vast criminal empire meant absolutely nothing without the brave woman trembling in his arms. The aftermath was brutally swift. Lorenzo ruthlessly purged his syndicate ranks, violently eliminating anyone loyal to Felix. He solidified his supreme power with an undeniable iron grip. Exactly 1 week later, the dangerous elite gathered nervously in the grand ballroom of the Romano estate. It was a mandatory summit to prove his rule remained absolute. Lorenzo stood proudly at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. He wore a flawless black tuxedo, commanding immediate silence from everyone. Harper walked gracefully beside him in a stunning crimson gown. He slid a massive diamond ring onto her trembling finger. He firmly declared that she was his wife. Lorenzo smiled genuinely. The desperate maid had made a foolish mistake, but it had miraculously saved his completely broken and condemned soul. Did this Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? The underworld is full of dangerous secrets, but nothing is more powerful than unexpected love. If you loved seeing the cold boss finally melt for his brave maid, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love thrilling romance drama, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing daily stories. Drop a comment below with your favorite plot twist.